Who is working on Pandemic X? Is it being experimented on right here at home in the United States? Let's have a conversation about not just gain of function, but the risk to the world of what could be being done right here at home in the U.S. with Dr. Robert Redfield, the former director of the CDC, and he joins me now on the Will Cain Show. Dr. Redfield, great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Will.
Let's start for a moment with COVID. It's suggested that the CDC may be reducing soon the isolation recommendations for people who are diagnosed with COVID. In the beginning, I believe it was 10 days. It's down to 5 days. States like California and Oregon have reduced it down to 24 hours after a fever breaks. But the CDC may meet in April and reduce their recommendations down from 5 days. Dr. Redfield, I don't hear anybody talk about COVID in the world anymore. I have no idea how many people have COVID. I don't know if anybody's getting tested for COVID. Everybody gets sick, but I don't know. Does anybody have COVID?
COVID's still a major problem. I just got news yesterday. My daughter and their whole household got COVID again. People don't realize that COVID right now remains, if you take out illicit drug use, COVID's the third leading cause of death in America right now. All right, that's a big deal. All right, a lot of people don't understand COVID really isn't a lung disease; it's a blood vessel disease, and that's why people that are older are at more risk for bad outcomes. People with hypertension, people with diabetes. So COVID's a big issue. It will continue to be a big issue, unfortunately, till the end of time. Lucky for us, it's largely not an illness that causes mortality or significant illness in those of us that are under 50. But it is a very significant cause of hospitalization and death in those of us that are over 60, 65, 70.
The projection for COVID from the beginning, and I believe this was something that you predicted as well, is that it would arrive at a place of community transmission. Basically, there's not much we can do. Everyone will get COVID. But as it gains more contagion, as it gains its virality, it loses its mortality, it loses its danger, it becomes weaker and more easily spread. And that kind of goes back to where my anecdotal just living in the world experience seems to be playing out. I mean, I don't know anybody who's getting tested anymore. This winter, it felt like a lot of people were sick, but I didn't have anybody say to me, I got COVID. So I don't know if everybody's just declining to get tested, which would make sense if it's dropping in mortality, right? If it's gaining virality but losing mortality, it becomes like a cold.
Yeah, I think a lot of testing today is self-administered home testing, and that's really what drives it. There's not as much what you say public health testing, government-supported testing as there was, say, in the first year of the pandemic. There's an advantage to knowledge of infection in that you can take more steps not to infect other people, particularly because COVID largely in many people doesn't cause any symptoms. So you wouldn't know you had COVID. The only way you would know is if you actually tested yourself and found out you had COVID. My grandson right now, he's totally healthy. His mother has COVID, but they did test him. Of course, now he has COVID. If he was to go to school and there was a vulnerable teacher, say a teacher there with diabetes and hypertension that was over the age of 60, he could be a source of infecting that individual. So I think knowledge of infection still matters, but I do agree with you, Will. I don't think it's being done with the rigor that it was done before.
And I'm just trying to put our finger on the pulse of the current state of the American public when it comes to COVID. I saw a stat, and you can tell me if you think this is true, when it comes to the vaccine. There's so many different debates to be had around the vaccine, but it doesn't look like the American public is interested in keeping up with vaccine boosters and taking and getting new shots. The stat that I saw, Dr. Redfield, was at this point, 21% of the American population is up to date on the COVID vaccine. 12% of kids are up to date on the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, I think that data is pretty accurate. The real issue here is, and I said this when I was CDC director, we don't want to promote vaccine hesitancy. I do believe the push that people had on vaccine mandates, for example, that pushed people and reinforced vaccine hesitancy. I think vaccine hesitancy is at a high. I don't think we positioned the COVID vaccines correctly from the beginning. I think people gave a false sense of what their capability was. I remember when it first was rolled out, people talked about getting 2 shots and you were completely vaccinated. Well, you were never completely vaccinated. We knew that this vaccine was going to be non-durable and that it would give you protection. People like myself tried to position the vaccine for the vulnerable, go after people that are in nursing homes, that are people that are in residential, housing, people that are over the age of 60. Let's get them vaccinated and let's keep them appropriately vaccinated. This vaccine doesn't last. It's non-durable. Most people, and I'm back in clinical practice again, and a significant part of my clinical practice is COVID. And I would say many of us probably need to be vaccinated at least twice a year to be adequately protected, not against infection. Remember, the vaccine doesn't protect against infection, and that's one of the problems. It does protect, though, against serious illness and death. So the vaccine still has a good role, but it shouldn't be I think there are a lot of mistakes made early on about overrating the vaccine, not giving credit to natural immunity, mandating the vaccine, having certain people even lose their jobs if they didn't get vaccinated. Those are all big mistakes. And
And I would
now
hope, and I would
now we
imagine it's
need,
part of your practice, risk reward.
yeah, we now need people that are highly vulnerable to realize that the vaccine could be life-saving. And, as I mentioned, most people get cancer screened or heart screened. Those are the first 2 leading causes of death. Well, COVID now is the 3rd leading cause of death in America. So you ought to take it seriously if you're at risk for death. And that is those of us that are at risk for death really probably are over the age of 60, over the age of 65, over the age of 70. I don't see the advantage of recurrent immunization of children. This virus doesn't really cause any significant illness in young children. And so, I think the lack of that discrimination from the public health messaging to the American public has really confused a lot of people. And I do think you're right.
No,
I think the consequences of the COVID vaccine messaging, unfortunately, has been a big instrument in broader vaccine hesitancy against measles, mumps, rubella, vaccines in general, and that's unfortunate.
well, I would love to see the statistics on all of that, all of those vaccines, including the annual flu vaccine. I'd love to see the statistics on that over the last 5 years to see if it's cratered, if the public acceptance of any of those vaccines has fallen because of the doubts sowed for all the reasons you just laid out when it came to the COVID vaccine. You were on Fox and Friends about a month ago, and it was a conversation I wanted to continue where we talked about gain of function research. Whether or not COVID came from a lab, and you've openly expressed your opinion on what was probably the origins of COVID, as have I. But our opinions are almost of no consequence when it comes to this conversation. It's the value of gain of function research. Gain of function research undoubtedly happens across the globe. There is a great amount of evidence that COVID was the product of a gain of function process and experiment. And you wrote a column with Dr. Mark Siegel saying, hey, listen, after COVID, everyone needs to understand this continues. It's not like everybody hit the brakes after COVID. In fact, right now, we are conducting gain of function research, not just in China, but is it true that we are also doing it? I think there was a legislative moratorium or a presidential moratorium at some point here in the United States, but some forms of gain of function research right here in the United States?
Yes, I think gain of function research, unfortunately, is still widely being conducted in university laboratories in the United States as well as around the world. And, I have called on a moratorium in both the Wall Street Journal editorial I did with Mark Siegel a while back, as well as the recent one that I did in the Washington Examiner, because I think that the gain of function research is most likely the cause of the pandemic that we've had with COVID. This virus was educated in a laboratory to infect man. And I think it was done for good reasons. People were trying to make a vaccine vector, but I think the scientific group was a little arrogant that they could somehow contain this. And we ended up with a pandemic now that's probably killed close to 20, I think our last numbers I've heard is 27 million people. So I think gain of function research there was a moratorium under Obama. There was some exceptions to that was made by NIH. That moratorium has now no longer in existence. People are doing gain of function research. And I think one of the challenges with that is that they can create pathogens that are more infectious or more pathogenic. And we really don't have the biocontainment sophistication that you need to do it. So I've called on society to have the debate about whether gain-of-function research has any intrinsic value. They need to be broader debate than just a group of scientists. And if society thinks it has value and it needs to be pursued, then they have to figure out how do we do it in a safe, responsible, and effective way. But right now, you are right, Will. It's being done in university laboratories, many of which that don't have the biocontainment that they should have, and it's being done around the world. I wrote the.
And I asked you at that time.
Go ahead.
I asked you at that time. My presumption, and a lot of the things that I had read, was that Chinese labs fall short of global safety standards, containment standards for doing these types of experiments. And I said, is it the most likely situation that we can call it pandemic X or whatever the next pathogen is, comes out of China? I think your answer to me was no, Will. You should be just as concerned about the safety standards. I don't know where the nearest university laboratory to where I live here in Dallas might be that's experimenting on pathogens, but you told me no, you should be concerned about what's happening right here in the U.S.
Yeah, I remember that, and I say that again, that China has some highly notable episodes of containment issues, both with SARS in the past and obviously I think with the COVID of the present. But I did say to you that I think your big concern should be the university labs that really don't have the biocontainment that they need. And this is why I think we really should, as a nation, call for a moratorium on gain-of-function research. You saw the recent article that we did with Mark Siegel in our recent op-ed that prodded it. It was a follow-up virus that had been manipulated in the laboratory that was a spinoff of COVID, which now was manipulated so that it was highly infectious for brain. And they made it so that it could infect humanized mice's brains. And they actually, rather than increase the transmissibility this time, they increased the pathogenicity. So this virus now, when it was all said and done, was now 100% fatal for the mice. So the idea that we're trying to make viruses more pathogenic is problematic, right? And I think we have to be careful. There's not an arrogance that science has. They think that they can control the good and there is no downside. I remember Fauci said in the Washington Post in 2012, when I argued with him, when some colleagues of mine had figured out how to take bird flu, which I do believe is going to be the next pandemic. It's going to be a great pandemic. I call the COVID the lesser pandemic. The great pandemic is coming. It's going to be a bird flu pandemic. It's going to have at least a 5% mortality, if not much higher. And that what the bird flu has to do to become pandemic for us is it has to learn how to efficiently infect humans. It hasn't learned that yet. I will say it's gone into about 25 mammals species now in the United States, including dolphins and seals and bears and bobcats and others. So it's learning how to go into new mammals. When it learns how to go into the human mammal, then we got a big problem. That said, in 2012, this group of scientists figured out the 5-6 amino acids that you had to change to make it highly pathogenic for man. And I argued that they shouldn't publish that. They decided it was science, it had to be published. Fauci argued it had to be published. And that's when he wrote that piece in the Washington Post. It said, if the price of gain-of-function research is that we have a pandemic, it's worth the price. Well, I don't think it's worth the price. I think we really need to recognize that this is extremely dangerous to try to be manipulating these pathogens in a way outside of nature, and that we can create a pathogen that becomes the source of a major pandemic for the human species, like I do believe COVID was. But I think the next pandemic, which will be a bird flu pandemic, which can come naturally from evolution, but it may take decades, if not centuries. But it's on the move. As I said, it's in 25 new mammals now, so it's moving. Or it could come unnaturally through gain-of-function research that could really happen in weeks, months, a year.
So 2 points really quickly of sort of background and context. So when you say you fear or you think that the next big pandemic will be a bird flu, and you said with a 5% mortality. I just want, for my sake and for the audience's sake, to compare that to COVID. What did COVID's mortality end up? Was it 1%, less than 1%, as compared to the 5% you're saying for the bird flu?
Yeah, it's definitely less than one. It's probably closer to 0.1% when you look at it all said and done. Yeah, if you look at all said and done, you'll see things published 1%, less than 1%. But if you really take the whole denominator, because right now, if you look at the United States, we've probably had I'd say over 300 million infections in the United States. We've had a little over 1 million deaths. So that'd be about 0.3% if you went across the board in the U.S.
So you're talking about something 15 times more dangerous in terms of
it could even be higher. If
mortality.
you look at bird flu's mortality right now, there's a bird flu, and when I was CDC, we follow it all over. There's a bird flu, there's two different viruses that have emerged, an H7 and H11, that could potentially become the next bird flu pandemic. They very rarely go into humans. And the humans that have been infected have been people that like are chicken farmers. All right. And when they get infected, they don't take the virus home and infect their family because it doesn't know how to go human to human. It really goes bird to human and then it stops. But of the humans that have gotten infected, and there's been about 1,000 so far that have been infected, 40 to 50% of them have died. Now, as this virus gains the ability to affect humans, as you pointed out when you started your podcast today, as the virus becomes it's pathogenic, as it becomes able to transmit better to humans, it probably will become a little less pathogenic. That's why I say I'm pretty confident it's going to be greater than 5%. The truth is, it could be 20%. Mortality.
All right, well, the one other point of background and context I want to get here, and this is kind of a big one, but let me see if I can set this up. And I listened to what you had to say, and we'll use bird flu as avian bird flu as an illustration of this point. You said two things, and please don't rebut them until I get all of this out, but I want to see if I can fully understand. You said you think the next big pandemic will be bird flu. You also said it could take a century for it to evolve. So next and a century is a big timeline that we're talking about here. And the reason I bring that up is I want to also understand and steelman, not straw man, but steelman the argument for gain of function. And the argument, I believe, Dr. Redfield, which you're in favor of a moratorium on this, is that we need to get ahead of that. For example, we need to get ahead of bird flu. I've always been like, how do you know what's coming next? You're shooting in the dark. So you're creating all these different pathogenic viruses in labs in North Carolina or in China, and one of them escapes, and you create a pandemic while shooting in the dark at stopping the next big pandemic. Because the idea of gain and function is to create something that you would then have the vaccine for, right? So you create it, then you kill it with a vaccine is the idea, I assume. So, I mean, even granting them the best premises, we're trying to get ahead of the next big pandemic. I mean, it could be in a couple of years, to your point. It could be a century, and it feels like you're shooting in the dark. Not you, but those conducting gain of function. Feels like you're shooting in the dark on developing a vaccine for something you have no idea what's coming. And you'd have to set that off against the risk of it escaping the lab and creating its own pandemic.
Yeah, I think the big issue here for me and the big concern, like when my colleagues published how to make bird flu, how to make the amino acid changes you need to make in 2012 to make it pathogenic for humans. That was published. So the recipe's out there. And the truth is, I could do it in, for a couple $100,000 with a couple postdocs. We could create that virus within probably less than 2 or 3 months, right? So it's there. I personally, I happen to believe in God. I think it's a miracle that hasn't happened already. Particularly by bioterrorists. I think it's a great risk for bioterrorism. Secondly, what I said is the ability for science to be so arrogant that they can manipulate these viruses, thinking they're doing it to help prevent a problem in the future where they actually create a problem. That could happen in months, not 10 years, not centuries. And so I do believe our risk in terms of our own biosecurity, and I will argue that our number one national security risk to the United States, I happen to believe, is not China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran. I think it's biosecurity. I think these pathogens can really bring our nation to the knees, and we're not prepared for it. So I think one of the ways for us to start is to at least put a moratorium. I don't agree with my colleagues that support gain-of-function research, and they're real. Tony Fauci and Francis Collins at NIH, big supporters of gain-of-function research. They think we need this so we can respond to the next pathogen more effectively when a bad pathogen comes. I would argue that we have the scientific technology now, that particularly now with the new mRNA technology, a lot of the molecular technology, we can develop the countermeasures for new challenges literally within months. Probably 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks, we can develop them. We don't have the manufacturing capability to make them available to the American public, and that should be something we focus on. But science is at the point that I think we can solve these problems scientifically quickly. We don't have to create the problem to solve it. I think that's the mistake my colleagues are making. They believe that if we do this research and we learn how these viruses change to make more pathogenic for man, and then we know how it happens, that somehow that's going to help us in the future. I think the odds are it's going to harm us in the future.
Dr. Robert Redfield, it was great to have a deeper, longer conversation with you, former CDC director, here on the Will Cain Show. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. God bless you. Yep.